All right. Welcome back for week 5. I hope that the course is going well. I hope that you found yourself prepared for the exam last week. Hope you had a great 4th of July weekend. Let's move ahead with week 5's discussion on class. All right, so when we talk about crime, and we're trying to talk about class at the same time, we want to talk about strain theory. Okay, so strain theory looks at the motivation for deviant behavior, and it's based on 3 different assumptions. Let's take a look at those. Assumption 1 is the idea that we're all naturally law abiding if we're just given the chance. Assumption 2 is the assumption that we break rules when we experience strain. Assumption 3 is the idea that strain originates in our social experience. Okay? According to the structural strain theory, deviance is a result of a mismatch between cultural goals and the institutionalized means of achieving those goals. So let's talk about that for a second. Cultural goals. What are we talking about that? We're talking about legitimate aims. Okay, so in the United States, we might talk about the cultural goal as the American dream. And what is the American dream? Economic success, owning a home, having a family. And the idea that the person achieves the American dream through hard work and education, for example, a college degree. So, education, for example, is an institutionalized means of achieving the cultural goal. Okay, military service might be considered an institutionalized mean. Okay, so cultural goal is, the shared sort of idea of success in the United States, and an institutionalized mean is something that's like an approved way of getting there. The person who came up with strain theory, his name is Merton, Merton. He said that when there's a mismatch between the cultural goals and the institutionalized means to get them, that can lead to deviance. And what he meant is, while nearly all of us are socialized to aspire to the American dream, we do not all have equal access to the institutionalized means of achieving the American dream. Merton identifies 5 modes of adaptation to the cultural goals and institutionalized means: conformity, innovation, ritualism, retreatism, and rebellion. Let's talk about what those mean. So the first one, conformity. When a person conforms, they are accepting the cultural goals and they're accepting the institutionalized means of achieving them. So this is a classic story of making it in America. You go to school, you work hard, you achieve the American dream. Okay. Innovation. When someone accepts the cultural goals but rejects the institutionalized means of getting them, they're adapting through innovation. An innovator may engage in illegal activities to achieve the cultural goal, such as like white collar crime. They may also engage in legal but somewhat deviant behavior. For example, dropping out of Harvard, like Zuckerberg and Gates did. But they both achieved the American dream despite ultimately rejecting the institutionalized means of getting there. The institutionalized means here being education. Ritualism. Other people become ritualist. The ritualist accepts the institutionalized means, but gives up or rejects the cultural goal. Okay, if you've ever seen that film Office Space, 1999, the 2 characters there, they're a great example of that. They were desperate to keep their jobs, and despite their jobs leading them nowhere, well, their coworker and friend, Peter Gibbons, encourages them to become innovators and engage in a little white-collar crime. Retreatism. Now, retreatists reject both the cultural goals and the institutionalized means of reaching them. They're just like, the heck with all this. None of this makes sense. Someone who's homeless or a drug addict might fit into that category. Finally, Merton had a 5th mode of adaptation. He called this rebellion. Rebels want to change something about society. They reject and work to replace the cultural goal and the institutionalized means of reaching them. Rioters, vandals, those would be examples of rebels. This is what leads us to the riots that happened in Baltimore, which we'll talk more about later. Merton's structural strain theory suggests that politically motivated riots are more likely to happen in communities with limited access to the institutionalized means of achieving cultural goals. In short, cultural goals are held out as achievable, but institutionalized means are either inaccessible or of inferior quality. So we're talking about this American dream. Let's stop and talk about that for a second. So we've got the American dream. We've got this, these culturally valued goals, money, status, owning things, and we have legitimate means of getting there, typically hard work, perseverance. When we look at Merton's strain theory, which we just talked about, it's really a critique of U.S. society. And their critique goes like this. Critique number one, Merton's saying, our culture's requirement that people achieve success, for example, wealth, is stronger than its requirement that they play by the rules to attain it. In other words, we claim that we value both of these things, these cultural goals and these legitimate means, but in reality, it's just more important for people to achieve success. Critique number two, there's a mismatch between our culture's universal success goals, for example, wealth, and people's differential access to the legitimate means to achieving those goals. This is really just a visual representation of everything I've just told you. Okay. Some people think better in charts, so I like to include the chart. You see here on the left, mode of adaptation, conformity, ritualism, innovation, retreatism, rebellion. And then does it adhere to cultural goals? Does it adhere to legitimate means? And then you see on the bottom there, rebellion, rejects culture, strives for change, can use legitimate means or not. There are some policy implications of strain theory. It points out that there's some things that we want to do to try to impact this. So, for example, equalizing the opportunities for success, de-emphasizing these cultural goals of material success, and re-emphasizing playing by the rules. Okay. All right, I want to switch gears just a little bit and talk about the role of media and crime in our society. Okay. Okay, so when we think about the evening news, for example, we think of the news as the truth. People are simply reporting the truth. The news is the news. It's nonfiction. It is simply the way things are. But the reality is that news is actually manufactured by a process of selection. Certain stories are deemed newsworthy. They're deemed to have a value. Okay. If something is likely to have people tune in and watch, then it's deemed newsworthy. If they're not, it's not deemed newsworthy. And this process of selection really creates a distorted picture of crime. What makes something newsworthy or not newsworthy? Well, that's something to talk about. Usually, action and excitement. Violent crimes, sexual crimes, those are often selected in as news. If there's a higher status victim, like a celebrity, that's going to be selected in. Cases where they feel like they can present it with no shades of gray, they can simplify it, that's going to be selected. And often, if something is sort of novel or unexpected, it'll become newsworthy. So these representations create a perception for the public of victims, of criminals, of deviants, of law enforcement officials. Okay. Our ideas about what a victim is, what makes a victim, what makes someone be a criminal, what sort of traits they have, what they're like, comes from the media. And this makes sense if you think about it, because research tells us the majority of public knowledge about crime and justice comes from the media, because most of us do not have any direct experience with the criminal justice system. Media informs the public's beliefs and attitudes about what the average criminal looks like and how he acts. We call that the criminal prototype. It informs our beliefs and attitudes about the typical process for solving a crime, the investigated process. Okay. And it informs our attitudes and beliefs about how criminals should be punished, appropriate sentencing. We get all of our ideas about that primarily from the media. And this can lead us to something we call the CSI effect. Watching crime shows can lead to unrealistic expectations regarding both crime and procedural justice. Okay. Now, I like me a good crime show. I watch a lot of crime shows. Matter of fact, my kids say most of what I watch is crime shows, and that's probably true. But there is an effect of doing that. A big complaint right now is that jurors think that all cases are solved with DNA. And people have traced this back to watching these crime shows. If we have real life cases that don't have DNA evidence, they're often lost because of this public perception of how a case should look. When a jury is made up of individuals who spend a lot of time watching crime dramas, jury members are more likely to find the defendant not guilty if there's no forensic evidence presented at trial. Jury members who watch crime dramas lean toward interpreting non-forensic evidence as too weak to warrant a conviction. But and so you may think, okay, well that's good. There's no forensic evidence. Maybe that person's innocent. Maybe they are. But listen to this. In the presence of forensic evidence, jurors who watch crime dramas are more likely to convict the defendant than a jury who doesn't, regardless of how good that forensic evidence is. So they may have forensic evidence that's really actually not very good, but because there's just some forensic evidence there, if I watch more crime dramas and I'm on a jury, I'm probably going to convict. There are different theories about how the media goes about deciding what I should see or not see. One is called the market model of media coverage of crime. And this is a theory that the media gives the public both what they're interested in seeing and what's in their best interest. But the problem is, very often, what I'm interested in and what I need to see are not the same thing. Why are we as a public so interested in crime? This is a complex psychological process, okay? We're making these downward comparisons to other people. In other words, I feel better about myself when I see other people doing worse than me. I both feel better about myself when other people are doing well, and I feel better about myself when I see people doing worse. If you doubt this phenomenon, turn on Jerry Springer and see if within about 15 minutes you don't start feeling better about your life. You tune in, you're thinking, I thought I was all jacked up, but I'm watching this and maybe I'm actually okay. Another reason we're so interested in crime, Durkheim talks about the fact that crime speaks to profound moral questions. It tells us the limit of human nature. And I realize human nature is on that slide twice. Apparently, I was very serious about that. It also informs us about the moral integrity of our community. It provides this sort of social cohesion. You think about when you're in a space with a stranger and they bring up some case that you've likely heard about, and you both, sort of express this like moral indignation about what's going on. You're sort of affirming that you both have the same kind of judgment yardstick, if you will, and it sort of bonds us together. We also have the manipulative model of media coverage of crime. This is the idea that the media acts in direct interest of the owners. This is a Marxist theory. It comes from the conflict perspective. This is the idea that capitalist societies are maintained through coercion and consent, that the dominant class has control over the intellectual means of production, including the media, and that they use the media to make us believe that the greatest threat comes from the street criminal, which deflects attention from their own activities. Media representations of crime. So we talked about how crime is selected according to whether or not a story is newsworthy, but media resources are often allocated to representation of those victims who can be portrayed as ideal. This is definitely a term you're going to want to know. The ideal victim. The ideal victim is somebody that when they're hit by a crime, when they're a victim of a crime, they are most readily given complete and legitimate status of being a victim. Complete and legitimate status of being a victim. The ideal victim is perceived as vulnerable, defenseless, and innocent, and therefore is worthy of our compassion and sympathy. And you want to think about this as like a hierarchy or kind of a spectrum. The typical ideal victim is going to either be elderly women or young girls because, again, they're vulnerable, right? Those people who are going to find it difficult to achieve legitimate victim status: young men, the homeless, and drug users or abusers. So at one extreme, we have those who acquire the status of ideal victim, and at the other extreme, you have crime victims who are never gonna experience legitimate victim status, and they're going to get very little, if any, media attention. The ideal victim may attract massive levels of media attention. They may generate collective mourning on a near global scale, and they may even generate significant change to social and criminal justice policy and practice. Let's look at a couple. Let me try that again. Let's look at a couple examples. On the left here, you see 10-year-old Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. They got international media attention and the biggest manhunt ever in the country when they went missing. And on the right, you have two working class kids who are younger than these girls, Patrick Warren and David Spencer, who also went missing, but did not generate much interest or coverage. Okay, so the girls on the left would be considered ideal victims. The boys on the right, not granted legitimate victim status. So you just saw how gender can play a role. Okay, the two girls got all the attention, the men didn't. Class can play a role as well. On the left here, you see Millie Dowler. She's a 13-year-old girl who went missing, middle-class family, stable family background, had never previously went missing. She's all over the front pages of national newspapers. Her disappearance attracts national attention. On the right here, we have Hannah Williams, who is a 14-year-old girl. She's working class, raised by a single mother on a lower income, had spent time in foster care. She got scant coverage in the media. Race plays a big role in how we present crime as well. You may recognize this guy. This is Michael Brown, who was killed in Ferguson in August of 2014. Now, there on the left is the picture that ran initially with this story when it broke. This picture was obtained from his Facebook page. News outlets went to the Facebook page to find pictures to use, and that's the picture that they chose to use, which I think we can all agree that picture paints a certain sort of story or representation about this victim. Other pictures that they could have used that they in fact scrolled past to find the picture they did use include the two pictures on the right, which I think we can all agree paint a very different picture of this guy as a victim. This is Mark Duggan, also killed by police earlier that same year. This on the left is the picture that the news media used when the story broke, also found on Facebook. But on the right here is where that picture was cropped from. I don't know if you can tell from the background, but he's in a cemetery. He's visiting someone's grave, and he's holding a little heart-shaped grave marker there. And again, I think we can agree that the not cropped picture paints a very different sort of story about him as a victim than the one that is cropped. Here we have James Egan Holmes. You may recognize him better in the picture on the right. He's the Colorado Theater mass shooter. But on the left here, this is the original picture that was released by the media when the story broke, which I think presents a picture of, guy next door, right? Likable guy. Of course, the picture on the right is how he shows up to court, okay? And more than just picture selection, headlines make a big difference as well. So let's look at a couple of these. So on the top here, we have a white suspect. This is not a victim. This is someone who's done something. They're described as Alabama suspect, brilliant but social misfit. This is a story of a college professor who killed 3 of her colleagues and wounded 3 others at a faculty meeting. Now, our faculty meetings don't get that spirited, but apparently this one did. But notice she's brilliant, but a social misfit. We're almost sympathetic toward her. Poor woman, right? On the right here, we have a black victim, not a suspect, a victim. Here's the headline. Montgomery's latest homicide victim had history of narcotics abuse and tangles with the law. This is a 25-year-old black man who was killed. The implication there, of course, he's not being granted legitimate victim status. the headline kind of implies it was just a matter of time because he's a drug user, right? So you see this very different presentation between how a suspect is presented versus a victim and by race. Let's take a look at some more. This suspect, son in Staten Island murders, was brilliant, athletic, but his demons were the death of parents. Yeah, this guy killed his parents, but again, he's presented as very sympathetic. Here we have this black victim. Trayvon Martin was suspended 3 times from school. Again, the implication being this kid was trouble. It was just a matter of time before something happened. And again, not being granted legitimate victim status. White suspect. Oregon school shooting suspect fascinated with guns, but was a devoted Mormon. So, he went into his high school and killed a classmate and injured a teacher, but hey, he was a great guy and super religious. Again, we have a black victim. Police, Lane Lakeland T had been shot before, death possibly drug related. So again, the headline sort of tells me how to feel about the story, right? It tells me for this white suspect, I should feel sympathetic. I should have some empathy for him. But this victim is not, in fact, worthy of my empathy or my sympathy because he, the implication here is he's playing some sort of role in his own death. This is that Santa Barbara shooting where the guy taped the manifesto and he killed women because they wouldn't have sex with him. Not the specific women he killed, but just women in general wouldn't have sex with him, so he went out on a killing spree. Santa Barbara shooting. Suspect was soft-spoken, polite, and a gentleman. His ex-principal says. This guy was in college when this happened, so it's interesting they dug back so far to get somebody to say something about this guy. Also, just a very interesting presentation because, again, it's telling me how to feel. I should feel some sorrow, that this has happened and some sympathy. But for this black victim, Ohio man was carrying variable air pump rifle, not a toy, when cops killed him, said the attorney general. This case, this is a guy in a Walmart store who went into the store and purchased a variable pump air rifle. What is a variable pump air rifle? You may know it as a BB gun. How many of you had parents who bought you a BB gun? Certainly, many people do, in fact, regard that as a toy, right? He went into Walmart and purchased this off the shelf. He did not have to get a clerk to hand it to him, which would kind of imply that perhaps it was in the toy section. He was walking through the store with it toward the cash register to purchase it when a shopper called 911 to report a armed black man in the store, and he was shot in the store and killed. But again, the way the headline is written, it tells me how to feel. I'm not supposed to really have a lot of sympathy because he was carrying a gun, not a toy, right? If they'd written BB gun, that's makes a different story too, right? White suspect, Ohio shooting suspect, TJ Lane, described as fine person. This was an Ohio teen who masterminded a school shooting where 3 students were killed and 2 were wounded. So he shot 5 people, but he's a fine person. So again, I'm supposed to have some kind of sympathy for this guy, right? You see all these headlines of these white suspects, it's almost presenting this sort of idea that they're like acting out of character, right? Black victim, deputy killed Marine out of fear for children's safety. This is an interesting case. This guy was putting his own children in his own car in a parking lot of a store and was killed by law enforcement. But again, look at the way the headline is written. Killed out of fear for children's safety. I will remember this case because I remember thinking, if you can't even put your own kids in your own car without being gunned down, I don't know how the world is supposed to work, right? But again, it's written in a way that I'm supposed to sympathize with the deputy, not with a person who's dead. Now, you may be looking at these things thinking, how does this happen? And nobody is saying anything about this. And how have I never noticed it? Because when you're reading the paper, these stories aren't right next to each other. They're separated by pages. You're just reading the news, story by story, and we're just taking in what's being presented, and we're not sitting here thinking about it. Now that I pointed it out to you, you will start seeing it all over the place because it is all over the place. White suspect, straight A student, plans to bomb the high school. That may be how he figured out how to make the bomb because he's a straight A student. But again, it's written in a way that I'm supposed to think this person is a good person. Black victims. Shooting victims had many run-ins with the law. So again, I shouldn't have a lot of sympathy or sadness about this because this is written to make me think this was inevitable. White suspect. Bank robbery suspect was outstanding Blue Hill student. She was charged in a string of bank robberies, by the way. She was an outstanding student, though. And again, they dug back to high school to get this statement that she was an outstanding student, which what does that got to do with her being a bank robber? But again, I'm supposed to think this is out of character behavior. Black victim. Police warned shooting victim was gang member. So again, this idea that his death was inevitable. I don't need to waste a lot of time or emotion. So these headlines are telling me how to feel. And you notice these black victims are not being granted legitimate victim status. All right, let's take a look at this visual. Percentage of African American suspects in TV news crime reports versus NYPD data. And we very quickly see that the news that's being selected, blue is percentage of suspects arrested who were African American between 2010 and 2013, and red is percentage of African American suspects in reports. And we can very quickly see that the crime news is disproportionately representing stories with African American suspects. Those percentages are much higher than the actual population of African American suspects. And again, why does that matter? Because that gives me as a viewer this distorted perception of who is committing crimes, what they look like. This is a cartoon, but it brings up some interesting stuff. So you can see here at the top, biker gang shootout, isolated incident. Wall Street fraud, isolated incident. Police brutality, isolated incident. So we have these situations where crime is reported and it's reported as, this individual level problem, right? Then Baltimore looting, evidence of endemic pathology in the Black community. News reporting does skew our ideas of whether something is just an individual doing something, acting out of character, etc., versus a group of people being problematic. I'll give you another example. Crack cocaine, which is used in greater proportion by inner city people of color, is punished 100 times more severely by federal sentencing guidelines, and it's virtually identical white powder equivalent used in greater proportion by white offenders. Okay, so we have these sorts of perceptions of what crime looks like and the people that do it, and that colors our response to it and what we think is appropriate or not appropriate. Another fact, men of color are disproportionately locked up in U.S. prisons and jails or otherwise under control of the criminal justice system in the U.S. Important stats to know. Half of the U.S. prison population is African American. Half of the U.S. population is not African American. That is a disproportionate presence of them. African American men are in fact 7 times more likely than whites to have been incarcerated at some point in prison. 1 in 3 African American men in their 20s is under the correctional supervision of the United States. That's a third of them. 56% of young African American in Baltimore are under correctional supervision, and 50% of African American men between the ages of 18 and 35 in DC. And again, when we see these stats, many times people try to explain them as, Black people just commit more crime. But we know from the data that's not actually accurate. Okay, this is a disproportionate representation. Almost 1 in 10 of all African American children have had a father in prison or jail. That's 9.3% of them. 3.5% of Hispanic children and 1.2% of white children. There's a big myth right now about Black on Black crime. You hear this a lot. They're just killing each other, right? But the reality is that most crime is in fact committed by people who knew one another. Crime is as segregated as the rest of America is. 84% of white victims were killed by white offenders. 94% of Black victims are killed by Black offenders. Most murders are intraracial. In other words, if I'm going to kill somebody, they're probably going to look like me. Why? Well, it makes total sense. Most of our social networks are populated by people who look like us. We have homophilous social networks. We talked about that word before, homophily, Homophily, homophily. I think I left an I out there, but you can Google it and figure it out. But yeah, it's the idea that most of us have social networks that look like us, and who do we usually end up killing? Folks that we know. Okay. Income plays a role too. Let's look at this. Proportion of men who've experienced arrest or incarceration. The purple is people from low income families, and the gray or darker purple, depending on your screen, people from higher income families. And you can look and see very quickly that if you are lower income, you are more likely to have been arrested or incarcerated. Race, again, makes a big difference as well. Excuse me. You can see that black men are much, much more likely to be arrested than people of other races, and white men are least likely. So race plays a big role as well. We're incarcerating people at an incredible rate as well. Just looking at numbers, not looking at gender and class and race and all that kind of stuff. We just look at the number of folks we have in prison, the number of folks we have in jail from the 1920s to 2010. We've had an explosion. We are just incarcerating folks at an incredible rate. The U.S. is, in fact, number one in incarcerating people. Yet, alongside this explosion in numbers of folks that we're arresting, our crime rates are, in fact, down. Okay. You look, murders down, forcible rape down, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, larceny, motor vehicle theft, arson. All of that stuff is down. Crime rates are down, but we are arresting more people than ever. Another visual to show you. Crime rates are down. Violent property crime rates. This is all the way through 2014. Down, 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 down. But we're still arresting and jailing and incarcerating in record numbers. Like I said, the United States is the world's leading jailer. We beat everybody else out. We take a look from 1960 through 2010. We've had this huge explosion. Federal policies like the Sentencing Reform Act and state policies like that 3 strikes legislation. So that idea that when I have committed my third crime, there's these mandatory minimums, have contributed to the 222% increase in the incarceration rate between just 1980 and 2012. Lifetime likelihood of imprisonment of U.S. residents born in 2001. We look at all men, you have a 1 in 9 likelihood. White men, 1 in 17. Black men, 1 in 3. Latino men, 1 in 6. We look at women, slightly different numbers, but similar sort of pattern. All women, 1 in 56. If you're white, that decreases to 1 in 111. If you're a black woman, 1 in 18. Latino women, 1 in 45. Same sort of data, looking at males and females and looking at race. We can see that while women are incarcerated in much smaller numbers, the trend remains the same, that if you are black, you are at a much greater risk to spend some time in some sort of correctional facility or another. Okay? And if you're white, that risk is much less. Bottom line, your specific social location in society impacts your likelihood of interaction within the criminal justice system, and it also impacts how that interaction is going to go. It further impacts how the media is going to portray your participation, as well as your likelihood of participation through fictional presentations. So who you are is often more important than what you have done. I hope you've enjoyed the reading for this week and it's been enlightening. If you have any comments, questions, or problems, please contact me. Have a great rest.